The main hall. There came a knock on Nicodemus's office door. It opened, and Justin and Mr. Ages entered. "Back so soon?" said Nicodemus. "Soon?" said Justin. "It's past noon. It's lunchtime." "Past noon?" Mrs. Frisby stood up, remembering her children waiting at home. Down in the rats' home, in the artificial light, it was hard to tell the passage of time, and she had been so engrossed in Nicodemus's story that she had not glanced at the clock. Justin was wearing a satchel like Nicodemus's, and from it he took a small paper package. "Here's Dragon's medicine," he said, putting it on the table. He asked Mrs. Frisby, "Did he tell you about the toy tinker?" Nicodemus said, "No, I was just coming to that." "But I can't stay to hear it now," said Mrs. Frisby. "My children will be waiting for their lunch." A plan was worked out. Mrs. Frisby would go home to take care of her children. Nicodemus, Justin, Arthur, and the other rats involved would work out the details of moving her house, which would be done that night at about 11 o'clock. "After the Fitzgibbons are asleep, and we're sure Dragon is too," said Nicodemus. Mrs. Frisby would return in mid-afternoon to the rose bush. Mr. Ages said, "And I'm going to lie down. After making that trip with this cast, I'm tired." "You can have your choice of rooms," said Nicodemus. "Now that Jenner and his friends are gone, we have 7 empty." "Thank you," said Mr. Ages. "Mrs. Frisby, when you return, I will tell you as well as I can exactly how to put the powder in Dragon's food." As she hurried home, Mrs. Frisby considered just how much should she tell her children about all that had happened, all that was going to happen. She decided at that stage, at least, she would not tell them about their father's connection with the rats. Also, that she would not say that she had volunteered to put the sleeping powder in Dragon's bowl. That would worry them. She could tell them perhaps when it was safely done, when, among other things, there would be no chance for Martin to volunteer in her place. She would tell them simply that, as the owl had suggested, she had gone to the rats and asked for help. She had found them friendly and intelligent, and a group of them were coming that night to move the house to a place where it would be safe from the plow. That would be enough. She could tell them the whole story later, when she knew it all herself. But it was not enough. The children were skeptical at first, then intensely curious, especially Timothy, who was looking stronger and feeling more energetic, but still staying in bed, primarily because Teresa and Martin had made him. "But why should the rats do that?" said Timothy. "We don't know them at all. Nobody does. They keep to themselves." "Maybe it's because the owl sent me," said Mrs. Frisby, searching for an answer that would satisfy him. "They seem to be impressed by the owl." "For that matter," said Timothy, "I don't even see why the owl wanted to help. He's no friend of ours either." "Maybe they thought some day we could do them a favor in return." "Oh, Mother," said Cynthia, "how could we ever do them a favor?" "You forget. I did do Jeremy a favor, and that's what started this whole thing." "That and my getting sick," said Timothy. "I wish I could get up. I'm tired of bed." "Not yet," said Mrs. Frisby, glad to change the subject. "You must save your strength, because tonight you will have to get up for a little while when they move the house. We must be sure you're well wrapped and hope that the night is warm." "It will be," said Martin. "It's turned quite hot outside." They ate lunch. That afternoon, Mrs. Frisby told the children that she must leave them to confer again with the rats about moving the house. When she thought of the danger she would face in just a few more hours, she wanted to kiss them all goodbye, but knowing that Timothy at least was already suspicious, she did not dare. But she told them only that they should not worry if she was a little late getting home for supper. On her way back to the rose bush, she felt quite relieved, almost cheerful. Her problem was nearly solved, and the final solution was in sight. If all went well, Timothy would be saved. If all went well. Then the thought of what she had to do came back to her like the clanging of an alarm bell. What worried her most was not so much putting the powder in Dragon's bowl, but the fear that at the last minute she might lose her nerve and bungle it somehow, that could wreck the whole plan. She looked toward the Fitzgibbons farmhouse, and there on the back porch, lying in the sun, was Dragon. He was watching a pair of sparrows playing in the grass halfway to the chicken yard. The tip of his tail barely twitched as he debated whether or not they were near enough to spring for. He looked very big and very dangerous. At least he was not looking in her direction, and Mrs. Frisby hurried on to the bush, directly to the hidden entrance, and stepped inside. When she reached the arched portal, Brutus was standing guard as before, but this time he greeted her politely. "I've been expecting you," he said. "May I go in?" "If you'll wait just a minute, I'll get Justin." He went inside the arch and pressed a small button on the wall. Mrs. Frisby had not noticed it before. "A doorbell," she said. "Yes, it rings a buzzer down below. If I pushed it 3 times, you'd see some action." "Action?" "Yes, that's the alarm signal. A dozen rats would come out this door ready to fight. All the rest, with women and children, would be hurrying out the back door." "I didn't know there was a back door." "It comes out in the woods in a blackberry bramble. It's got a longer tunnel than this one." When Justin appeared, they went down the same hallway as before, but this time, when they reached the chamber where the elevator and the stairway led down, Justin paused. "Nicodemus thought you might like to see our main hall. Just a quick look. He said you asked about the plan." "I did," said Mrs. Frisby, "but he didn't tell me about it." "Well, it's more than just a plan now, but we're used to calling it that. If you see the main hall, you'll get an idea of what we're doing." So instead of going down as they had before, Justin led the way across the chamber where, as Mrs. Frisby had noticed, the tunnel continued. They walked along for what seemed like several more minutes. "Somewhere right along here," Justin remarked, "we're entering the woods. You'll notice the tunnel runs a bit crooked. We had to bend it to go around tap roots, some as thick as fence posts." They went on until they came back to a fork in the tunnel. "Right fork leads to our blackberry bramble," said Justin. "Left fork leads to the main hall." They took the left fork. Now, brace yourself for a surprise. For ahead came noises, the sound of many rats talking, a sound of hurrying and thumping, and of machinery running. They stepped into a room as full of activity as a factory. It was the biggest room Mrs. Frisby had ever seen, half the size of a house with a ceiling and floor of hard gray rock. It was brightly lit with electric bulbs. Here, the large-sized ones strung unshaded, and beneath them were rats at work everywhere. Rats running electrical motors and ran belts that ran small circular saws, lathes, drills, grindstones, and other tools that Mrs. Frisby could not even name. Rats hammering, welding, cutting, but most of all, rats hauling. There was a steady procession to and from the far end of the chamber, and each of these rats wore a harness to which was fastened a pair of large, sturdy sacks, one on each side, like a miniature pack horse. As the rats trooped in, their sacks were empty. They disappeared into a part of the room that was hidden by a high wall of wood. When they came out, the sacks were full and heavy. As she watched, a troop of 10, their sacks bulging, went past her out the tunnel. They greeted Justin and nodded at her, but they did not pause. She noticed that just inside the entrance, an electric fan whirred quietly, aiming inward, pulling fresh air into the room from somewhere out in the woods. Mrs. Frisby stood beside Justin and gasped. Beside Justin and gaped. She felt dizzy at the sight. The motion, the noise, and the size of the room, which must have measured 20 feet long and almost as wide. "How could you ever dig out such a big room?" she asked. "We did it," said Justin. "We found it. It's a natural cave. You can see that the ceiling and the floor are solid rock. That's the reason, or the main one, we chose this rock. That's the reason we chose this spot to live. Others had lived here before us, probably for centuries before there was a farmhouse. Bears. Then wolves, then foxes, then groundhogs. We had quite a cleaning job to do, I can tell you that. When we found it, there was a large hole only a few feet long leading straight in, but it was so full of sticks and leaves you could hardly see it. We closed that entrance entirely and dug another longer and narrower one, our back door. Then we dug out our living quarters under the rose bush and the entrance you came in. But our cave is still our chief workshop. Let's go in. As they entered, some of the rats looked up, some waved and smiled, but all quickly turned back to the work they were doing, as if they were in a hurry. They're all on a schedule, Justin explained, talking close to Miss Frisby's ear to be heard above the noise, so they can't stop working. One group, especially busy, was gathered around an odd-shaped object of wood and metal about a foot long. It was curved and had a point at one end. It looked, Miss